Hello, Hey Boomer listeners. Thank you for joining us today. As you are aware, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. This was first introduced in 1981 to not only bring more awareness to others, but also to connect and unify the millions of victims of domestic violence. Domestic violence takes place in our nation every minute of every day. It affects not only women, it also affects men and children of all different races, status, religions, and culture. It is not something that victims of domestic violence are generally talk about because they have a fear of what people will think. They have shame, and they also believe that there's nobody that's really going to help them. But today we're going to talk about it. There are many agencies and advocates that provide education and support for victims and their families. Annette Johnson, my guest today, is one of those advocates, and she's going to share her story with us about what brought her to doing this kind of work. Before I bring her on, I wanted to remind you that I am still taking a few clients for Turn Your Retirement Upside Down, the coaching program that I put together to help you focus, get engaged, and excited about what comes next in your life. It's an 8-week program. And what we're going to cover are things like the life cycle of transitions. We're going to talk about your visions and values. We're going to talk about your life themes and the changing roles that you have now. And we're going to help work together to craft the ideal life for what's coming next. So if you are interested in talking to me more about that, you can drop me an email at wendy@heyboomer.biz. I look forward to hearing from you. And I also wanted to say, we are building a community here with Hey Boomer. And I just wonder, what community means to you. So for me, community is a place where you feel like you're a part of something. You feel like you belong, and you feel important and like you want to participate. And that's what I feel when I think about this Hey Boomer community that we're building. And I really want you to help me grow this and participate and be part of this community. So I look forward to your comments. I love seeing people come in and saying hi. So nice to see all of you. So be part of this community, help us grow this, and just feel like you are such an important part of this community. Now I'm going to bring Annette on. Hi, Annette.
Hi, Wendy. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I have to tell you, I love the name of this show, Hey Boomer. I am a proud boomer. I need a
Yay.
t-shirt that says proud boomer.
I know, right? I need to start getting t-shirts. So thank you for that. Some of you may remember Ken Dolan Del Vecchio. He spoke to us about parenting adult children, and he introduced me to Annette, for which I am forever grateful, because we just absolutely hit it off. And I want to share Annette with you all, but I also want to tell you a little bit about her. Annette is an accomplished global professional development strategist. She is a leadership coach for women, and she also is a diversity and inclusion champion with 30 years experience in a Fortune 100 firm. Annette's diverse background encompasses employment-related dispute resolution, business ethics, and compliance. She has designed and facilitated programs for over 300,000 individuals, wow, across the US, Canada, Mexico, Asia, and Europe for both major corporations and nonprofits.
I think I have to correct that number. It's 30,000.
30,000.
Yes. 300,000 is like, oh.
30,000, still 30,000 people. That's a lot of impact that you've had. Very cool. Annette is also the author of a book called Fly, Fly, Forgive and Love Yourself, which is currently available on Amazon. And she also is the host of a new podcast, which I loved when I watched, and it's called Living in the Good Space, Conversations on Thriving Wherever You Are in Life. I love that too.
Thank you.
Annette also grew up in a home where her mother was the victim of domestic violence, and we're going to talk more about that in our discussion. Annette, is there anything that I left out that you want to add about your background or your family or anything like that?
No, I think that's a mouthful, right?
It is impressive, yes.
Thank you.
Well, all right. So, ready to dive in?
I'm ready.
Okay. So, to give us some perspective, can you give us a little background about what impacted you to kind of push you in this direction of starting to work in advocacy around domestic and intimate partner violence?
It was a long journey, and I was thinking about how to answer this question concisely as possible. But it really started, it's kind of multiple legs to this. So I was preparing for my 50th birthday, preparing for my mother's 80th birthday, and also in the middle of being certified in coaching. And so there was a lot of significant transitions that were going on in my life. I was really looking to make peace with a lot of things. I wanted to enhance my relationship with my mom. And I really felt like, turning 50, it was such a milestone. Can't believe that was 10 years ago already. It was such a milestone that I really wanted to spend time doing some self-examination and reflecting and thinking about how I could be more intentional going forward. And so the life coach training preparation really, really helped. That was a catalyst in all of that. It really gave me the time and space to be able to think about it. And so what emerged out of that is my experience as a child with the domestic violence. It was the critical component of my childhood. So there was really no way that I could do the deep dive without looking at that. And so I did. That led to therapy. I was in Penn Station one day on my way to do work for the company that I worked for at the time, and struck up a conversation with a woman. It was a hair conversation that ended in her being a trained and licensed therapist in trauma for women. One thing led to the other. I wound up in her office, I don't know, within 3 or 4 months, and I spent 2 years with her. So in addition to the coaching, I spent time with the therapist, because they're two very different things. And my focus with the therapist was really on my experience as a child. And it was the first time that I had been acknowledged for that experience, where she actually said, "You're a survivor, and what you're describing to me are symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder." I had never heard that in my life, and I was 50. So it put what I experienced in context, and it gave me, the first time in my life, an opportunity to speak about it, to share my experiences, and to get some guidance on how it had affected me and what I could do moving forward.
So she said to you that you were a victim also, but you were not the actual abused.
No, I had witnessed as a child my mom being abused. I was between the ages of 7 and 9. And so I never considered myself a victim, because it wasn't something that happened to me. It was something that I witnessed. But going to therapy helped me understand that being in that environment and witnessing that firsthand at such a young age had a critical effect on me.
Yeah. At the time when you were the child, did you feel like there was anything you could do to help your mother?
Well, I did. I was the oldest of my siblings at home at the time. And so my younger sister, I'm 8 years older than her, and then there are two in between. And so I didn't know that. I learned now in the work that I'm doing that I had a safety plan that I had created. I didn't know that's what it was at the time. I was just reacting, in the moment, where I had resources that I would tap into, my grandmother being a critical resource, and
Mhm.
I would let her know what was going on, and she would spring into action to make sure that we got help and that everybody was safe. Um, that happened very organically. It wasn't something that I thought I should do or needed to do. It just kind of like happened.
Hmm.
It was the only thing I knew to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So you became a survivor very young then. You immediately said, I have to take action to protect myself, my siblings, and my mother.
And my other siblings were just too young. Even today, when they hear me speak or we talk about it, they were just too young to remember the details of situations like I remember them. And, I was kind of I was the caretaker at that moment. And so it was
Yeah.
all about sheltering and making sure that, they were safe as well.
At 7 years old.
Yeah.
Wow. So what were some of the effects that this had on you growing up? I mean, you've had a very successful career. So how did this impact you?
Well, that's a very good question, and that was the question that we spent a lot of time on in therapy, was how it had impacted me. So that gave me an opportunity to do a lot of connecting of dots. There were things that I felt. There were um, there were emotions. There were memories, experiences that had a bigger effect on me than I think I allowed myself time to really explore or think about. So I lived my life in survival mode because at a very young age, I was taught
Mhm.
how to survive, and what to do to survive, given that situation. And so I didn't realize that I took those traits with me into adulthood, and everything was about survival for me. And
Wow.
yeah, and so it was very eye-opening. It was very healing for me to have that professional perspective and to really give context to what I had experienced, because I think I had gotten to the place where I just buried it. I didn't talk about it. I didn't share it with anyone. My mom didn't talk about it. My family didn't talk about it. Things happened. We sprung into action. We got on the other side of it, and life just went on as if it never happened. And
Mhm.
so it was very helpful for me. It was validating, is the word. I felt validated for the
Validating.
first time in my life that this little girl had experienced what she experienced. Her feelings were real, the emotions were real, the terror that she felt was real. It was just validating. That's the best word I can describe. And in that validation, it just helped to set me free from a lot of things.
So you shared with me, and I want to be cognizant of what you're comfortable with, but you did share with me how some of this played out in your personal relationships as well as your work relationships.
Mhm.
Are you comfortable with sharing some of that?
Yeah, in my relationships, the connection that I made was to my visceral reaction to aggression.
Mhm.
I I did not like any form of aggression. So if I felt as though someone was being overly aggressive with me, it put me in a very, very negative space, even if the aggression wasn't intentional. It was my perception. It
Mhm.
felt aggressive to me. And I think that I don't think I know that had a lot to do with the aggression that I saw with my mom, and how that aggression would elevate to violence. And so being able to understand that and the connection to what my relationships and how I was reacting to certain things with those relationships, it made sense, because there was a history, and I had experiences that I had not addressed. And so those things, even though they weren't addressed, came with me right into adulthood, and they manifested in different ways that I didn't connect the dots back to what I went through as a child until I got into therapy.
So, for instance, you mentioned that with your husband, you had to appreciate how understanding he had been because you didn't realize how understanding he had been.
Yes, so my husband has been a champion for me in this space. He's connected me with some great resources that I do advocacy work with to this day. I mean, we've been married 36 years, and early on in our marriage, I didn't have a name for what I was experiencing. I couldn't even articulate it. He certainly didn't have any frame of reference because I didn't talk about it. But any kind of pushback or aggression was a problem for me. And so it made communication very challenging and difficult, because if it didn't end the way I wanted it to or I thought it should, it felt like disapproval, it felt like rejection, all the negative stuff that was connected to some of the things that I had witnessed my mom going through and the reaction from her abuser. And so connecting those dots, I mean, now we laugh about it. We can sit and talk, and it's like we have these aha moments, and it's like, oh my God, can you believe? I'm like, how did you put up with me? I put up with you for all these years. But he was always very supportive. The therapy, very supportive of that. The minute I said, I discovered in therapy that it might be helpful for me to do some advocacy work, he went to work immediately connecting me to people in the community that he knew that were doing that type of work. And so doing the advocacy work helps me to share my story. But it's a continuum of healing for me, because whenever somebody sends me an email or calls me or at the end of a event comes up to me and says, thank you, I'm just starting to get my courage and nerve up to talk about my experience, I know that I'm doing the right thing, and it helps me to stay in that positive space, that constructive space.
Yeah, and in fact, we have a couple of people commenting that they want to thank you for your courage for telling your story.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So you as a child figured out kind of what your safety net was, how to do that. And so there's a lot of questions that people have about women or men that end up in these abusive situations, and how do they get there? Why do they stay? Can you talk about that a little bit?
So I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of what I learned being in this space, because I had a lot of judgment towards my mom, a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, because I didn't understand the very questions that you just asked. I didn't understand how she could be in this abusive relationship, how she could subject us to this type of experience and the environment that was created in our home. I didn't understand any of that. And so that left room for me to do a lot of judging towards her and about her and her experience. And so working in this space, going to therapy, volunteering, joining with an organization to get up close and personal training and experience around this shed some light that I didn't have before. And so one of them is, we can't answer why. And a lot of times, maybe the woman in the situation can't even answer why. And there are a lot of stereotypes and myths out there about women being in abusive relationships. Things like, well, she must like it, or somehow or another, she did something to attract this, or she's weak, or she has low self-esteem. And that could be nothing further. There could be nothing further from the truth. I've met women who are professional, highly educated, senior levels, economically sound, great lives that have wound up in situations where they were connected to someone who was abusive. And they didn't set out that way. It wasn't like they went on a dinner date and somebody slapped them or abused them at dinner. It was something that, revealed itself over time. And so I think the worst thing that we can do is to try to answer that question for women in that situation, or to judge them in any way as to why they're there. Because no one sets out, that's not a goal, as far as I know. I have not met one woman who had a goal of being connected to an abusive partner.
Right. Yeah. And what I've read about it is, they start out as very charming
Yeah,
typically. And
absolutely. And if you look at abuse, even more broadly, that's what happens. People wind up being in situations where if they had known, then they wouldn't have made that choice.
right.
But they didn't know, and they found out over time. And then being in the situation, there's so many factors. We talked about this a little bit. Now that I'm older and I've been doing this work for a while, I look back, I can't imagine what my mom went through. If it
Mhm.
was that hurtful and painful for me, and if I've had such a difficult time digesting what I experienced as a child, I can't imagine what she went through emotionally and mentally. I know what she went through physically, but I don't, mentally and emotionally, we didn't talk about it, but I could only imagine, and I can understand why she didn't talk about it, because there's so much shame that's associated
Right.
with it. And there's so much judgment that's, passed on women. I've even experienced judgment, in my circle. People have questioned.
As a child, you've experienced judgment?
Well, as an adult now sharing my story, I've experienced
Really?
judgment, because it's not, it's so one thing I tell people, I share my story. When I put my book out and I started doing this, I had a conversation with my mom and I said, this is very important to me. It's a part of my healing. And I knew, I had discovered that I wasn't going to be able to get that from her because she wasn't in a place to be able to do it. And so
Hmm.
I had to respect that. I could not drag her along with me. Um, for whatever reason, she did not feel comfortable, but we had a conversation about my need to be able to make peace with this as I continue to grow, and my need and desire to want to be able to do work in this space. And so she was okay with that. But I certainly have received comments from women about sharing my story and or sharing my mother's story, which I clarify all the time. I'm not sharing my mother's story, I'm sharing my story. It's
Right.
not my place to share another woman's story about domestic violence. I can only talk about how I was affected by it.
Yeah. And I think that is an important distinction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, we've both been trainers in the corporate world. And one of the trainings that I was exposed to was how to recognize victims of domestic violence in the corporate setting and what to do about it. Have you had experience with that?
Yes, I went through the certification training that touches on a lot of different aspects. And there are signs. It's such a delicate situation though, because you don't want to assume
Right.
that someone is being abused and they're not, or you don't want to force someone to share their story or put them in an uncomfortable situation, because that's only going to create more distance. And so any chance that you do have of maybe helping them, by forcing them when they're not ready is going to create more distance. And so that's why I do the work that I do, because I think education and awareness is so important. And the more platforms that I am associated with that allow me to do that, that's what I do. Because you never know who's listening. You never know who's going to see the recording or hear something that will prompt them to make that shift and to seek help and to start exploring and asking questions. But there are certainly warning signs. The obvious are physical. I mean, seeing someone come in with a black eye and tons of makeup, or maybe someone who's very withdrawn, not comfortable speaking up, being around others. I've certainly had my share of experience, real life experiences at work that obviously I can't talk about, where there were women who were being abused and that abuse was starting to show up in work. And so there are definitely strategies and resources that companies have in place to help women. So if there's somebody who's listening and is experiencing that, you can certainly reach out to your employee health organization at work. And if they don't have someone on staff, they're certainly connected to a resource that they've engaged that can be available to help you start to think about, how do I process and deal with what I'm going through? And what are some of the options for me to exit safely?
And Annette, what if somebody who's listening feels like this could be affecting their sister or their mother? Are there ways that they can offer help without alienating them, as you said?
Yeah, so for me, I think being educated is the best thing that you can do, because I think the natural part of us, let me talk about me. I'm reactive. So I know if someone close to me in my circle, a friend or a family member comes to me and says, this is happening, I'm going to immediately want to defend them. I'm going to be outraged. And I'm going to
Right.
immediately want to insert myself into that process. And that's the love and the care that we have. But what we have to do is step back and make sure that we are educated on the best way to be able to help them. So you can use the same resources that are available to women who are in abusive relationships to get that education. And I encourage people to call the hotlines, to go to the websites, to talk to professionals who are experienced at dealing with situations like this, and say, I know of someone in my circle and I think they're being abused. This is why I think that. These are some of the signs. What do I do? What is the best way for me to help that person? Because now you're getting advice from the experts. They are trained and skilled at doing this. Because once a woman decides, and this is what I learned over the years, once a woman decides to leave, that's the most critical and dangerous time.
Mm-hmm.
And so you want to make sure that you are giving the best advice and guidance in terms of preparing for that exit and getting the help and resources that they need. So as much as we may want to do it because we love and we care for the person, we really need to rely on the experts to help guide us in that situation, because we want to make sure that the woman can exit as safely as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's really important what you just said, that's the most dangerous time. So get the help. Don't just run in there and grab them out of the situation.
And that's a myth. That's a stereotype. Just leave. Well, why don't you
Yeah,
just leave? Well,
right.
if a person could just leave, they would. It's not that simple. And we want people to leave, but we want them to leave in the safest way possible. So we want them to have a safe exit strategy, and they can do that with the proper guidance and resources.
I just put up the hotline number, website and phone number there, and I'll leave it up for a little while. But you have a conference coming up.
Yes.
And it's called Denormalizing and Deconstructing Abusive Relationships. Will you tell us a little bit about the organization that's doing that and about the conference?
Yeah, so Ocean's Garden, I met the founder, Makai, last year. She invited me to speak at her annual event, and she brings women together around this very topic. How do we empower and support each other in the various phases or transitions that we're going through as it relates to abuse. And wonderful conference that she puts on every year. And so she invited me to join her board of advisors. And so I am working with her now on taking her organization to the next level. It's a nonprofit organization. And so one of her first events with her new board is this denormalizing and deconstructing abusive relationships. It's going to be held October 24th. It's virtual. You can go to Ocean's Garden, and I'm going to spell it.
Can you spell that?
OSHUN_S Garden. You can go to oceansgarden.org, or you can go to Ocean's Garden Facebook page or the Fly Coach Facebook page to register. And it's going to be a 1-hour event. We have a panel of advocates that are going to be joining us. I'm going to moderate the discussion, and we're going to talk about these myths and stereotypes that are associated with, intimate partner abuse, and the things that women go through when they find themselves in these situations. So we want to demystify it, and we want to talk about these myths that are not real and stereotypes, and how we can be more supportive and continue to elevate this topic so that we can eradicate the violence against women. So we have the panel consists of women who have experienced domestic violence. We also have a male's perspective, and Shavar Jeffries uses his voice consistently in powerful ways. to bring awareness to this. And we're going to have a conversation about what we can do.
Yeah, I've registered for it. I'm really looking
Oh,
forward.
thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'm looking forward to it. We did have one comment that we haven't really addressed, and I guess I'm sorry that we haven't, Rob. He talks about it's not just physical abuse. There's a lot of emotional abuse
Yes.
that is part of domestic violence.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they also become warning signs. So there's the verbal abuse, there's emotional abuse, there's the controlling behavior, controlling your finances, controlling your autonomy, controlling your relationships,
Your friends,
who you can be around, how much time you can spend with them. And so there are a lot of different levels to domestic violence. And it doesn't always start out with the physical. Most times it evolves into the physical, and it starts with some of the warning signs around your finances being controlled. You know, you not seeing a paycheck, or you not being able to spend the way you want to spend. That's all being controlled for you. And then the relationship piece, who you can be friends with, who you can spend time with, even family members. Really controlling your circle, and making sure that you are only spending time with and how your abuser wants you to. The finance, like I said, not having any control over your finances whatsoever. The verbal abuse, name calling. And it's interesting because every now and again I'll have a conversation with someone and they'll say, yeah, no, my partner has never physically hit me.
Mm-hmm.
He's punched a hole in the wall occasionally. And I'll say, well, how did that make you feel? Did that make you feel fearful? Do you have anxiety when you think maybe he's going to get angry and throw something? And so they're all connected. Those things are connected, and they build, they build off of each other.
So as I was preparing for this and reading about all of that, like my question is, there's got to be degrees. So my two marriages were both very controlling, jealous, a lot of that going on, put downs, some of that too, but it never got to the point of physical. I mean, there was a lot of loudness and it was scary. I would never think that's a domestic abuse, but where's the line? What do you say to that?
Well, and this is me speaking, right? I'm not speaking on behalf of an organization or anyone, but I think you have to be able to assess your relationship holistically, right? And ask yourself, is this a relationship that I am happy in, that I feel safe in, that I feel respected, that I feel loved? Do I feel like I have a partner, a companion, a friend? So I think you have to ask yourself all of those questions to assess where you are or what type of relationship that you have. Because violence is one thing, abuse is another thing, feeling unhappy is another thing. And the three of them don't have to neatly align for you to ask yourself those questions about your relationship. And so if you are in a relationship where you don't feel safe, and safe doesn't have to always be physical.
Right.
I don't feel safe in sharing my ideas. I don't feel safe in expressing my opinions. I don't feel safe in being my authentic self. You have to assess your relationship. I think that's like foundational. You have to assess your relationship and what that relationship does for you or to you and how it affects you. And then you can kind of take it from there, because maybe there isn't any physical abuse. Maybe the person never did anything and you're not afraid of them ever physically harming you. But that doesn't mean that that's the only level of assessment that you need to make to be in a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
Like that shouldn't be the standard,
It should be part of the reason I'm not in those relationships.
So he doesn't hit me should not be the standard.
Yeah.
So I think before even getting to the what do I do about this piece right now that the physical piece, that's an emergency. That's crisis time now. But before you get to that, it's how do I describe my relationship? How do I feel about my relationship? How does it make me feel? Those are questions that we should be asking ourselves when we are in relationships, period, to make sure that we're in the right relationship. Because abuse does not have to be physical to harm you, right? The
Yes.
ongoing verbal abuse and emotional abuse harms you in different ways.
Yeah. There's a couple of comments here that I want to share, Annette. Doris says, in her adult wisdom, I remember my mother telling me that every woman has a different line of, I guess, what's acceptable.
Yeah.
And then Miriam, who is an attorney, she said, and she represented battered women. She says, one of the battered women I defended actually killed her husband and was charged with murder. It was the only way out to survive. The jury acquitted her because they understood. Wow. And she adds that you are so helpful to understanding the whole problem. And of course, men can be victims of abuse too.
Yes, and I hear that all the time. Yes, men can be victims of abuse. However, the overwhelming amount of abuse that's happening is against women and transgender women. And so, yes, men can definitely be abused, but the statistics are still overwhelmingly slanted towards women at the hands of men. And when you talk about, in the advocacy space, when we're talking about, well, what do we need? What can we do? I think one of the things that can be extremely helpful is men's perspective, men voicing their values against domestic violence. And I've met some men who have organizations that they're building, or they volunteer with women's organizations, and they are lending their voice and they're lending their time because they understand how important it is to speak up against this. And I think we need more of that. We need to hear from men who their values are different and they don't believe in violence. They don't believe in hurting women or harming women. And I think it would be helpful to hear those voices more loudly and more clearly.
So Kathy asks, what help is there for the abuser to help them stop being abusive?
Well, I think if an abuser feels that they have a problem, whether it's a mental problem, emotional problem, etc., the first thing that comes to mind for me is therapy. Or if they have a substance abuse problem that might be driving it. It really depends on what they see as the root of the issue, right? And that could be so many different things. And I dare put myself in a place of expertise for that. But I would say that anyone who's experiencing something that brings out the worst in them, does not make them feel good about themselves, does not tap into the best part of themselves, that therapy is always a great place to start because they're trained to help you peel the onion, right? And to get to the root of the problem. And there's always a root. There's always something going on deep down inside that's triggering and sprouting up and manifesting itself in different ways. And so getting to the root of that, I think, is very critical.
Yeah, and I wonder if the courts provide, counseling or rehabilitation or anything like that.
I don't know. I don't know if it's called rehabilitation, but I know that there are anger management classes that sometimes are mandated for people to go through. I'm not sure to the extent of other types of training, but I know anger management is one.
Mm-hmm. And another question is, there's a lot of help and advocacy for women. Are there programs specifically for men who have been abused that you know of?
There are. I have heard of organizations that support men. I do not have the resource information for that, but I'm sure if you Google it, it will come up. And I think that there are more and more men's organizations that are being developed, nonprofit organizations, especially to get to young men, to help them deal with their emotions and to be more proactive and constructive with maybe some of the things that they're feeling and experiencing, and to help change this narrative for
Right.
young men who are coming up and who are coming out of these homes. The whole reason why I got involved with this is because I wanted to be able to speak about how it affected me as a child, because I felt like that was missing in the conversation, because children are deeply affected by this. They're losing both of their parents. They're watching. Sometimes children are on the scene when a mother has been murdered. So the effects of this on children emotionally and mentally it can be dire if they don't get the help they need immediately. For me, think of age 7, 9, I didn't have my first conversation with a trained, licensed professional until I was in my early 50s.
Isn't that amazing?
That's a long time.
Mm-hmm.
No conversation. I was completely silenced. I didn't even feel I had a right to be able to speak up about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the early intervention is so critical for children when they're experiencing that, and they're able to start, how they say, unpacking it, have somebody help them unpack what they're seeing and what they're feeling and experiencing at an early age. So, so that they're not carrying that with them through adulthood.
Well, I'm so grateful that you got that help. So it inspires you for your book,
Yes.
Fly, and it inspired you for your podcast, Living in the Good Space. Can you give us a little insight into both of those?
Sure. So the book, I had this idea about the book years ago when I got into coaching. One of the things when you go for certification is you're coached. That's the training. So you are coached one-on-one, you're coached in groups. And so it helped me to continue this journey of seeking inner peace. I wanted to make peace with these things. And I saw that there was opportunity for me to show up differently. In my senior years, I have a vision for, my life and how I want to live. And so this has all been the work in progress to do that. And writing the book was very therapeutic for me. It helped me to sit down and really put a mirror up to myself. And the writing, it helped me. It helped me identify what I was feeling. And it also helped me to write my vision for myself going forward, who I wanted to be. And I spent a lot of time naming the things that I was experiencing. So I held myself accountable in the book. And I identified the aha moments that I had about myself. And so by the time I was done writing it, I felt like I had literally shifted from a place of quicksand where I felt like I had tried to get out and then I was getting sucked back in. And so the book helped me to climb out and to align myself with a team of resources to help me continue the work. And then Living in the Good Space, the podcast, is kind of a continuation of that. And that was prompted by the beginning stages of the pandemic. And I thought, how do you stay positive when you feel like everything around you is chaotic and is going crazy and there's so many uncertainties? How do you keep yourself motivated? How do you keep working towards your vision and your dreams when you feel like you don't even know what tomorrow is going to bring? And so again, it's all about shifting from that negative pool of energy into positive and seeing the world through a different lens and your experiences through a different lens in a way that keeps you productive and keeps you engaged and keeps you positive and working towards the things that you want.
Yeah, I think we got inspired at the same time during the pandemic to do our shows. Yeah. And on your show, you talked about a range of topics that you were going to cover that, impact our lives. Anything from parenting to retiring to thriving to eating.
Yes. So I look for guests who are doing what the show talks about, thriving no matter where they are in life. So they are using their skills, their resources, they're leveraging their strengths to to be positive and to thrive. You know, when I look back over my life, I was in survival mode for decades. Decades. That's all I could think about was surviving. I need this and I need to do this to get that. I never took the time out to think, I don't have to be in survival mode anymore or all the time. There are times where you do have to do that, but there are times where I can think differently and I can think about the thrive, you know, how do I thrive?
Mhm.
Because that requires something, a different skill set, right? You're tapping into different levels of energy and skills when you're thriving versus surviving. And so the guests will share from their different perspectives what's working for them, in hopes that our listeners will hear or discover something that will help them go to that next level of thrive.
Yeah. Well, I've got the YouTube. I've had that up there. So y'all look at that. It really is a good show. And
Yeah.
oceansgarden.org or theflycoach.com, denormalizing and deconstructing abusive relationships. It's this Saturday at 1.
Yes.
Sounds like a great panel. So I'm really looking forward to that. I always ask my guests, Annette, if there are 1 or 2 takeaways that you would like to leave them with.
Okay. I think one of the main takeaways is if there is someone who is listening right now or watches this recording and you are in an abusive relationship and you're not sure what to do, you can't even begin to see yourself on the other side of it, I would encourage you to reach out, find a safe place. Maybe you might have to use someone else's phone. Maybe it's when you're at work, you call, but find a way to reach out to one of the resources and have a conversation with them about your situation so that you can get some objective guidance and you can hear from experienced and trained people. Like, this is what they do. This is what they're dedicated to. This is what they do. They help women survive. They help women shift out of situations in the safest way possible. So I would encourage you, make that your first step. You know, you can do that in a private way without anybody knowing, and you can have that conversation without even sharing your identity to just get some guidance. And the other thing I would leave is know that love does not hurt. You were not created to live in fear. You were not created to be abused. You were not created to be in a home environment where you're afraid to go to sleep, where you're afraid to be who you are. You're not created to live in fear. And so love yourself enough to seek help and to begin to take the steps that you need to move forward.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Such an important conversation, Annette, and I really appreciate your courage and your honesty in sharing all of this with us.
And Wendy, thank you. Thank you for creating Hey Boomer. I appreciate you having me on as a guest and having this conversation. I'm a work in progress. Every conversation makes me a little bit stronger and a little bit more confident. And so thank you very much for having me.
Oh, you are so welcome, and thank you. I'm going to leave the hotline website and number up there while I tell you about our guest for next week. Her name is Kay Coughlin, and Kay has a dream to create a world that is generously inclusive of all adult generations. Her company, which is called Facilitator on Fire, offers 2 primary services. She does workshops and seminars to end age bias in the workplace, and she also does caregiver coaching. And what we're going to talk about is being a caregiver. So many of us in the boomer generation are already caregivers or will probably become caregivers for our parents. And it can be, and some of us also might still have children that we're taking care of. So it could be a very difficult situation. Kay has written an ebook about that. She is actively working with people in that space. So I think that will also be a very important conversation in a different way than this was. One more thing, I just wanted to say one more time, if you all are interested or anyone is interested or knows somebody who might be interested in turning your retirement upside down, please have them drop me an email and we can chat about what that might look like. And I always like to end with a quote from C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis said, "We are never too old to set another goal or dream a new dream."
Yeah.
So I hope that you all will continue dreaming with us, participating in the Hey Boomer community. I am so grateful for all of you, and I look forward to seeing you next week. My name is Wendy Green, and this has been Hey Boomer.